dozens of articles and completed many research projects centered around the Mohawk Nation and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, many of which you can find on his online platform, The Wampum Chronicles. His third book, An Early History of Akwesasne, The Works of Franklin B. Hough, was released in 2020, and it will be the focus of today's talk. Copies of this book, as well as his earlier works, will be available for purchase after the presentation. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Darren Bonaparte.
So everybody, hello. Great to be here. This is my first visit to the Historical Association. Just got a wonderful tour, looked at some of the artifacts and even some archaeology and things. And hopefully we'll be able to have a relationship where we can continue to take a look at what they have and try to bring some more knowledge together and try to increase the wavelength of knowledge that we have. A little bit about myself that wasn't covered in the biography. That was a nice biography, by the way. I didn't write that. Somebody did some research on it, came up with that.
Sorry if I missed something.
I gave a talk last week at in the Mohawk Valley. It was the Sir William Johnson conference. So I gave a talk, and the person that introduced me had found some old introduction about me that was so long I was embarrassed by the time I was and I had written that one too. It sounded like a job application when I was looking at one. Wow. And sometimes when I think about my career as a history guy, and if you're a history guy, you're hard pressed to call it a career because there's not a heck of a lot of jobs in the industry. You kind of have to eke it out yourself. Find history where it is and see if you can contribute to that somehow, that understanding of the past. And I would like to give you a little intro of why I became a history guy. I wanted to be a writer when I was a kid. I was obsessed with Star Wars and all of that kind of stuff. I had no mindset about my community, Akwesasne. In fact, I tell a little story about that when we were growing up, it wasn't like today where everybody is obsessed with Indian culture and we raise our kids and cultivate them to be a part of that. In the 60s and 70s, when I came along, it was not like that at all. It was a completely different program. And I didn't even know I was Native until me and my brother were playing Cowboys and Indians one day.
Yeah.
And he says, "Why don't you be the Indian and I'll be the cowboy?" And I said, "I don't want to be an Indian. What are you, crazy?" And he said, "We are Indians." And I said, "No, we're not." He said, "Go ask Ma." So I went and found my mom. I was just a little toddler guy, right? Like 4 years old. I went to see my mom and I said, "Is it true? Are we Indians?" And she said, "Yes." And I burst out crying because the only Indians I ever saw were the ones shooting at the stagecoach on the Western movies, which were shown all the time back then. I don't know what the heck they showed on TV other than Western. That's my only memory of it. And so I cried and she said, no, it's okay, it's okay. That's just the TV stuff, she said. We're Mohawk Indians. She took me into my grandmother's room and she had a little picture of our saint, Gadli de Gakwita, on the wall. It was a little Indian woman walking among some birch trees along a riverbank. And I had seen that picture so many times. She said, "This is Saint Gadli de Gakwita. We pray to her every night to take care of Wendy, our cousin, who's in a hospital." And I'm like, "Yeah, okay." And then she says, brings me into the living room where my grandfather was watching Maple Leaf Wrestling at the time. You guys remember that? And there's Don Eagle and Billy Two Rivers, Mohawk wrestlers from Kahnawake, slamming Killer Kowalski and Mad Dog Vachon all over the map. And she says, those are Mohawks. And there's my grandfather hooting and hollering. He had a stroke. He couldn't speak or walk very well, but man, he could roar when wrestling came on. So she said, those two guys are Mohawks like us. So it's nothing to worry about. Calm down, stop crying. But that's just the way it was back then, is everybody was raising their kids to get a job, to go out, get educated, find some place in this world, because my mom was raised by people that lived through the Great Depression. They had to work. My grandmother cooked for a wealthy family in Syracuse, so she came home and taught everybody on the res how to cook spaghetti. So my grandmother was one of those people that knew you had to work. If you want your kids to live and have a belly of food, you're gonna have to work. So all this stuff about Indian culture and all of that stuff, it's a big thing today, but back in those times, in the late 60s, early 70s, it just wasn't a foundational thing that we all talked about. It just wasn't that way. It's changed. It's gone 180 degrees. So that our kids, when they graduate, they're all decked out, they've got their full outfit, they've got the feather gastoa, they're right into it. And so growing up in that atmosphere where we didn't have that, when you become an adult, suddenly you kind of take a look backward to see where you've come from, who you are, because suddenly you're surrounded with people that want to know that stuff, and if you don't know it, you look pretty foolish. Especially when you go off to college and people find out you're an Indian and they're like, oh my God, what's that all about? And I'm like, I don't know. I was hoping to find out here. And one thing that happened was my older brother, the one who broke the news, well, he went off to art school and came home and got a job at the Traveling College, which is one of our cultural centers on the reservation. And we were raised Catholic, but he just fell in love with the culture, the singing, the dancing, the stories, the legends, all the crafts, everything. It was so rich that he just fell in love with it. He said, that's it, I'm never going to that damn church again, I'm going to be Longhouse. And he was the first in our family to ever even think about that. And I've only had one niece since then said, okay, that's for me too. But the rest of us all were pretty much set in our ways. We loved St. Gudeli de Gakwita. My mom and my grandmother and several other relatives went to Rome in 1980 when she went through the process of beatification.
Wow. And
then in 2012, when they did the canonization, my mom and my sister, and still a huge amount of our people, went to Rome for that too. So that should kind of indicate to you that I come from a very churchy family, you know, we're serious about that. But so in my growing up, and this is why it's cool to be a history guy, is you're always thinking about the past before you. You don't realize that you're a part of history too, and that you're witness to a major change in your community and in the society in general. And I'm not just talking about the technology, which, you know, we've gone from being people with just a phone and a radio and a television set to now all the junk that you can think of, right? So all that happened in my lifetime. So someday I'll tell future generations about that, but it was a cultural thing, the renaissance of Haudenosaunee culture that happened around me in my same lifetime that I've been able to observe. I didn't go to the distance my brother did to join. That was his thing. And when you're a younger brother, you don't want to do everything your older brother does. You got to find your own path in this world. And one day he said to me, he goes, you ought to get involved in this kind of stuff. And I said, I don't know. He said, what's your history buff? He goes, we need that. Because I was a World War II buff. When I was 11 years old, we saw the Charlton Heston Midway movie, and I had to make every aircraft carrier model I could find. So I already had that kind of a historical leaning, right? So he said, nobody's making wampum belt reproductions. He said, they used to make tons of them. He says, I made one or two, but that's the thing you could do. So and that was how we told history. We recorded history with wampum belts. I got a few of them I brought with me. I'll just show you a couple. So he said, why don't you start making those belts? And so that's what I did is I contacted somebody who made these really nice reproduction synthetic wampum beads, and I ordered 30,000 of them. And that's just, well, you know, that's what you do when you want to plunge into something. You go crazy. You just do it. And start big. I had to make the biggest wampum belt known. 7,000 beads I had to make. They say start small, work your way up. No way, no way. I had to have the biggest one. So I began to make these reproduction wampum belts. I had to research them and find belts that help tell the story of my people. That help tell the story of how did we go from living in the Mohawk Valley to living up on the St. Lawrence River. What's that all about? And I was able to tell that story by finding specific wampum belts in history that have a known story that associate with that narrative. So I reconstructed a narrative by making 24 wampum belt reproductions. Well, not just belts, but also the strings and all of that. So I'm not really here to talk to you about the wampum stuff. I'm really here to talk about my COVID project. And here it is. I got a job as the tribal historic, St. Regis Mohawk Tribe's Tribal Historic Preservation Officer in 2019 in January. And so that job basically concerns with repatriation of artifacts. Under federal law, the federal government funds each tribe to have an officer like me who deals with repatriation and also observes all of the public projects that break ground. Whenever there's a big federally funded project, they have to do archaeology to make sure they're not disturbing some kind of historic or prehistoric site. So they fund my office to do that kind of stuff, to consult. And to also work with whatever museums, historical societies, to kind of act as like an official voice of my community. So this was kind of in recognition of the decades of research that I had put into research and publishing and giving talks. So my buddy, he basically offered me the temporary job and said, we're gonna post it, I hope you apply for it. And so I applied for it and I got the job. I was so psyched. I think they kind of overlooked a few of my educational background credits. Might have been generous about that. Anyway, so I got this great job, and then they decided that they're going to have to shut down because of the pandemic in 2020, and they had to lay some of us off. So I got laid off, and so I'm sitting at home in between trying to apply for unemployment. Living in Canada and applying for unemployment in the States, it ain't gonna happen. And so my wife, on the other hand, is a nurse at COVID Central, as we call it, Cornwall Community Hospital. So she didn't get laid off. She had to go in extra. And so there she is, risking her life on the front line. I said, I have to make the best of this time that I have. I'm forced to be here at home. I gotta write a book. I've had a couple books out. It's been like 10 years since I did a book, so I'm gonna do it. Because if you're a history guy, you know you've got a pile of stuff that you've transcribed that's sitting on some flash drive that you're probably never gonna touch again, but you were obsessed about typing it all up in the first place. So I have tons and tons of that stuff. And I said, now's the time to do that. I'm sitting at home on my duff, I'm gonna bang out a book. So I said, I'm gonna do it methodically. And what do you do if you're a history guy who plays by the history rules, is you have to do your homework, which I've been doing, but then you have to also kind of approach it methodically by saying, you've got a subject that needs a new voice to come in and bring it back out for the modern people. You've got to do your homework. You've got to read what other people have written about the subject. Clear that off your deck. Find out what they said. And if there's anything in there that looks troublesome, zero in on where they're drawing from. Go and check their sources. This is all the stuff they bore you to death with in school. But that's the method. So I did that, and when I first got interested in history back in the early 1990s, I was working for the other council in Akwesasne. And I was given the assignment of, one of the chiefs said to me, "We got a big tour coming in. Can you whip up a little history brochure for them?" Sure, I can do that. I didn't really know anything about history, but I said I can bang out a little brochure. Don't worry about that, chief. So I went to talk to our land claims researchers who were just a couple doors down from my office. And I told them what I was assigned, and they said, "Sit down." So I sat down, and the lady's name was Sally Benedict. She's passed on now. And her partner was Donna Roundpoint. She's still around. They piled stuff on top of in front of me and said, "You've got to read this, read this, read this." And the first thing they gave me was a copy of Franklin B. Hough's A History of St. Lawrence and Franklin Counties, New York. Now, if you're a local history person, this is Moses. And the first chapter is all about the Indians of Oswegatchie over in Ogdensburg. It's loaded with stuff. The second chapter is about St. Regis, or Akwesasne as we call it back home. And that was held out to me as the source, the secondary, primary, it's the big enchilada of our history. So they photocopied a whole section of that, gave it to me and said, "Read this and you're off and running." So I read it, just blown away by how much research that man did. And so as years went by, that thing was just sacred to me. The material that he found and he uncovered has been cited by every historian who ever came poking and prodding of our history and our past. That's the big dog in the yard. So an homage to Franklin B. Hough. So deciding to finally publish about my community, I said, I've got to reckon with Dr. Hough. His chapter is so important. I'm going to republish it, basically. I have to republish it. So, because it's just in this old book, it's nowhere else. These are hard to find. It probably costs about $150 now to find a copy of this. And as you can see, I've got it still tabbed. That's the mark of a history guy, is he's got tabs in every book he owns. And so I said, I'm going to republish that, so basically I have to retype the whole bloody thing. Fortunately, there's scanning technology and you can basically lift the text, but a lot of it you have to kind of tinker with to make it perfect. So, and I also dug into the archives. I was able to visit Albany, well, not during the pandemic, this is something that happened years ago. I had gone to Albany to look into his papers at the New York State Library, because he mentioned other things that he had found. And so I searched through his journals and found other materials that he collected. He first came to Akwesasne in 1852. So I talk about that in my book. The first chapter is about his visit to Akwesasne. He came, and I got to talk a little bit about him. Who was he? Well, he was a doctor. He was a very young man. And he was mostly living in Lowville, but had been educated in Ohio, and he was an actual medical doctor. And he had 2 wives, he had kids, and decided at some point that he loved history so much that was going to become his thing. And so he embarked on the history of St. Lawrence and Franklin counties. And that was his first big, huge, major project. So being methodical as we're supposed to be in the history game, he thought, I'm going to start with the natives, what was here before all the settlers showed up. Well, he did his best to gather all the material he could. And part of that meant coming to Akwesasne. Nobody had ever written about us before him. Nobody. just the people that had to write about us. Administrators, government people, military people, priests, those kind of people had to generate materials. So he went to visit as many of those kind of people as he could. And so I found in his journals his little descriptions of making his way onto the reservation, meeting the priest, spending a couple days with the priest to gather, make copies of everything. In those days, man, history was so tough to do. You had to make handwritten copies of everything, and you had to be really good at making sure it was all letter for letter. And so that's what he did. And he came and started to generate that history. And he wrote an article, which he mentioned in his journal, that he published in a local paper. And I had never dreamed I would ever find that article, but it did. It popped up. On the internet, you've got all these insane history nutballs out there who will transcribe and photograph and do whatever they got to do, and they'll create these incredible resources. Well, this old Ogdensburg newspaper is online, and sure enough, I found the article he wrote and published it in the book. So I included all his journal entries, that first article he wrote about our people, and so I give a pretty good window of his work with our people. So then the next chapter is his actual chapter about us that was published in that big black book. I see you back there. Hello, my old friend. Anyway, so he publishes that section. That's the next part of my book. And then I said, there's more in this book than just that chapter. There's mention of us all throughout the whole book, before and after, so cull through that. This was my chance to be a really anal historian, and I just got right into finding every little tidbit I could about my people. And then, not only did he publish our stuff in that book, but he also came back, because he had various jobs with the censuses. I think he was a state census official. And so he came back to us in 1856, collected more material, and then also came back 1865 for more of that kind of census work. And then later, I think about in the 1875 era, he also came back and then published about that in 1888. So I have all that stuff. That's all in the book. So that's why I call it an early history of Akwesasne, the works of Franklin B. Hough. And it basically explains how, that one chapter, which is so important, was just a part of his ongoing relationship with the community. And he described the changes that he saw from his first visit to his last. So that's all in there in his little article which he wrote, and which was published in a federal publication of some kind. So he says, he goes, I noticed a change. One of the changes that he noted was when he first came, everybody couldn't wait to tell him what clan they were, the animal totem that goes with the clan. Everybody knew theirs, but he said the next time he came back, nobody wanted to talk about that stuff. So he's kind of giving you an indication that the cultural pressures on people made them very self-conscious about expressing those old things. And that is basically the 1800s for you. When you get into history, if you were like me, you really only wanted to talk about the 1700s, the 18th century with the French and Indian War, the American Revolution, the big cuffs on the coats. That's the glorious past that is just so rich and fun. But then you get into the 1800s, you have one good war, the War of 1812. And then everything changes. No longer do the outside forces want you to fight as a native warrior in a separate war party, covered head to toe in war paint with just a breechcloth on. No more of that. No. By the time the American Civil War happens, if we were going to fight in that war, we're regular soldiers. We're dressed up just like everybody else. We're standing in line getting shot with everybody else. No more separate war parties. No more wampum belts to recruit you to fight in the war. all of that old stuff is now fading away. And so even our alliances started to fade away in the 1800s. They went by the wayside because back in the colonial times, the Indian villages were the only things around. Up and down the St. Lawrence River, just little pockets of Indian villages. So with that in mind, we were able to have these vast networks and alliances. But when you're suddenly surrounded by newcomers and new settlements, new villages of European people, French, Irish, English, you name it, they're all there. You're dealing locally. So your need to have this vast network of native allies is suddenly faded away. So your focus, your concentration is local. So that explains why our people in the 1800s underwent such a drastic change. It's more than just suddenly wearing pants. It's a little bit more than that. It's about having a psychological overlay on you now. And so, like I said, the War of 1812 was the last of those great colonial wars where, you know, we had Indian war parties out going up and down the frontier, actually bringing a sense of security to the settlers, who at first were told, oh no, there's a war coming. The Indians of St. Regis are going to come and scalp and kill everyone here. You better get out of here. No, actually, when we did show up, the settlers had a sense of security and a feeling of, hey, at least those guys are here. One lady who had a bunch of our warriors show up at her farm was just scared out of her boots, and until she went out to the barn where they were spending the night and saw them all in prayer. And so she said, I felt greatly relieved after that. And she said, from then on, whenever you saw an Indian patrol in the area, you felt a sense of relief that they got your back. They're there to protect you. So, yeah, that's the really cool thing about that War of 1812, is that it was pretty much the end of the old glorious Indian war party. And then by the time the Civil War came along, one of my ancestors, and this is the story of how I got to be a Bonaparte. His name was John Cook. And when he and his buddies went to Malone, New York to sign up for the war, and they had to do that. They had to go to Vermont, to Massachusetts, other states, Pennsylvania, because they didn't want to all be in a big cluster. They wanted to kind of be, you know, I think that was just a policy, just not to put all your eggs in one basket that way. So John Cook went to sign up for the war, but he had the most common name in the world, right? John Cook. There's probably a million of them. So one of his buddies said, why don't you sign up under your nickname, which was Bonaparte? And he was nicknamed that because he used to fight when he was a kid. He was a scrapper. And because later he had to apply for a pension after the war, and he had to explain and document why he had two names, why he was both John Cook and John Bonaparte. So he had to have his friends write affidavits saying, well, when he was a kid, he was crossed like a king, so we called him Bonaparte. That's how he got the name. So that's why I'm a Bonaparte today. We're not a big family. I think he had one kid. And so we're kind of a small little family in Bonaparte. We have that arrogant emperor name. So we kind of make up for our small numbers. Yeah, people, I get that all the time. People come up to me and they say, are you any relation to Napoleon? Hello. So I've had to deal with Napoleon and his reputation all my life. That's fine. If you're going to be named after some European guy, you might as well be the biggest bad guy there ever was. People will leave you alone. And I tell people, yeah, actually Napoleon, most people don't know this, but he was Mohawk. He got a little out of hand, so we threw him on the first boat to France, and then something went wrong, took the place over. So are you any relation to Napoleon? Yes, and in fact, if he hadn't lost at Waterloo, I'd be the emperor of the world right now. Still hoping to get it back. Anyway, so yeah, so all of these events that we all hear about in history, they had a real impact in Akwesasne. Our people were in every single war, and we continued to fight in every war and every conflict, every single major war. We had a sniper in World War I who had an amazing kill count. He was a sniper. I don't remember exactly how many he killed in the war. Most of them were the enemy too. I'm so inappropriate. And then World War II, 333 of our guys went to fight in World War II. In every branch. Marine Corps, we had a Marine Corps fighter pilot by the name of William Cook. And he fought in the Pacific. He was a full-blown Marine fighter pilot and died in a training accident for the Korean War. He re-enlisted and was training pilots down in South Carolina, Cherry Point. And unfortunately his aircraft crashed and died. And then we have his brother was Andrew Cook, who they named our Legion after. He was shot in Italy, I believe. So we had a lot of those guys. And then the Korean War, yep, a whole bunch of our guys fought there. Vietnam, my uncle Vaughn Aldrich, the attorney, he was in the Marine Corps, he was a CB. My uncle Philip Tarbell was in the Marine Corps, I think around the time of when John F. Kennedy was the president. So yeah, it's a long heritage of service. But at the same time, we still have this drive to be an independent, sovereign Mohawk entity. You know, that those things are not incompatible. And we view the United States and Canada as allies. You know, even though we're all technically one or the other, we all have, you know, I'm a Canadian citizen because I was born in Cornwall, Ontario. I didn't have any choice in that. That was my mom. So that's the closest hospital I'm going. You're going to be Canadian, kid. So anyway, now to be a historian of the Akwesasne community, I chose right off the bat that I was going to be a by-the-book historian. You know what I mean by that? What I mean is, buy my book, would you? No, what I mean is, I'm going to be strict about what I find. I'm not going to let politics govern what I write. Some do. Some go into it with a political agenda, with a hatchet. I don't. That's not my thing. I say, I'm going to let history decide what the history is. What do the materials say happened? Yes, I'll be critical of it. Yes, I'm going to look at oral tradition where I can find it. Yes, I'm going to look at archaeology, material culture studies, whatever. I'm going to look at all of it. All of it has to come in. And I can't just repeat verbatim what history says. Well, the attitudes and the ideas in there have to be updated to some extent. But you have to kind of play by the historical rule book. And a lot of people don't. And a lot of people justify that as saying, well, I'm trying to rebuild the nation. So that's the thing that I've been up against since I started. I'll give you a for instance. Right after I got started, I published my first series of articles. Oh, I never did do that brochure, by the way. That became a newspaper series. Wow. And my first series was published in 1993 in our local paper, because that's all you had back then. We didn't have the internet, didn't have all, you know, if you wanted to publish, you had to do it locally. So I did my first series. Then the traditional chiefs, whose paper I had published in, asked me if I would do a research project for them. And I said, yes, sure, what is it you'd like me to do? And they said, we want you to prove that the Mohawk Nation Council of Chiefs is historic government at Akwesasne. Okay, yeah, I'll take that on. Well, they brought me into their office. They said, here's our archives, here's our file cabinets. There's a lot of stuff in there. Go to town and then go look for whatever else you need to confirm that premise. Now normally, I was young, normally if somebody comes in and tells you what they want you to find, just turn around and walk out. 'Cause they've already made up their mind what the history is, you're just there to fill in the blanks. And so I did my diligent best, I poured through everything they had, and I had to come back to them after a while. First, I cleaned the fridge out. The fridge was a mess. So I said, all right, my mom taught me this. She says, if you got a job and you run out of things to do, find work, find something to do. Clean the fridge if you have to. So I cleaned their fridge out. And then they said, what's going on? How's the research project coming along? And I said, well, sorry, Chief. I said, I hate to break it to you, but you guys are not the historic government here at Akwesasne. You're not. In fact, you're the last government to show its face here. There was a traditional government, but it was under the Seven Nations of Canada, which was the old French alliance of native villages up and down the St. Lawrence. You guys represent the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, which was ancient, but didn't have any presence, didn't have any involvement here at Akwesasne until recently, until the late 1800s, when they decided to revive that and named a bunch of chiefs here. So I said, that's all history is ever going to unfold for you. You can search, you can hire 10 of me to go out and scour the globe for documents. You will never be able to justify saying that you are the historic government. You're the latest government, actually. Well, that ended my association with the Mohawk Nation chiefs. But that set in stone for me that I'm going to maintain an independence as a researcher. And that has been my marching orders ever since. So I've kind of had to go against the grain of just about everybody in the community and I made a lot of enemies. Some of the people that I work with in land claims for a while had kind of got swept up in the nationalistic fervor. And they weren't alone. We had chiefs thinking the same way, that we all had to go back to the old Confederacy. And they all consciously chose to ignore our whole history of being part of New France, of being part of another alliance. They decided that wasn't good enough. No, we have to be pure Haudenosaunee. And so they began to write and create propaganda to that effect. And I refused to go along with that. I debunked it. And what happened that saved me from being hit by a car was the internet. In the 90s, the internet came along, and I didn't know what the heck it was. Didn't know how to get on it or anything, but I knew that was a big thing. I somehow knew that was going to take over the world. So as soon as I was able to, I started my own website, the Wampum Chronicles. It started in 1999. And a friend of mine helped me do it. She had her own website. She did up my pages. I just submitted the materials, and she put it all up and created my website. Mm-hmm. So having that as a platform made it was the smartest thing I ever did. It made my name. It made me untouchable. I didn't have to worry about getting my stuff published in the local newspaper, which was controlled by one faction. I didn't have to get the approval of the councils or nothing. I just put my stuff up, boom, they couldn't touch it. One person that really didn't like what I was saying about history was even overheard telling a colleague, who do we know at the internet? We got to get his site down. Who do we call at the internet? They said. It's all over the world. It's a faceless robot conquering the world. You can't call it. So having that, and then going the next step of actually publishing books. My first book was basically taking on Haudenosaunee legends, the great legends of our past, the creation story, the story of the peacemaker, all of those things. I said, I need to kind of take care of that first. Just like Franklin Hough, he decided to look into the Indian thing first. Well, I said, I've got to address all of those epic stories. So all I did was just gather as many old versions of those stories as I could and lay them out linearly from, made a chronology of them from the earliest to the latest, and then studied them and said, how do those stories evolve over time? What does their evolution teach us about our ancestors? So the discoveries I found were pretty enlightening, and I came up with a skinny little book to encompass my research into it. And I ended up kind of debunking some of the very sacred myths of my people. It's not really nice to debunk sacred myths. But I felt I was in the neighborhood, I might as well. So I did it. And so that book coming out didn't win me anymore. Didn't win back any of the former friends who became enemies. Made me a few new enemies, but it also put me in another realm, because being a webmaster of a website is one thing, but having a published book is another deal. You're suddenly in a different echelon. So then I decided to follow that up with a book about our saint. Like I mentioned, we have Saint Adelita Gakwita from the 17th century, and I felt there was a need to address that. I felt that needed to be taken on, because most people writing about her didn't care about the culture that she came from. She was just Bambi in the woods, walking around until she meets a priest in their eyes. But I said, well, her culture that she grew up in had a big part to play in how she ended up accepting new teachings. So I had to explain, how did those Mohawks living in the Mohawk Valley, having contact with Europeans for a very brief time, suddenly convert to Catholicism, leave the sacred Mohawk Valley, and come all the way up to the St. Lawrence Valley to start over? What was that all about? So I plunged into that whole history and began to learn some things about this wonderful young woman who became a legend, became a statue, a symbol. I wanted to know who was the person. And that clearly came out of the materials. The priests that knew her personally, who baptized her and convinced her to move to Canada, they wrote really detailed biographies about her. More than any other Indigenous person has ever been written about, even now. They knew her intimately. They wrote her life story, because by the time she passed away at the age of 24 years old, and she had already really impressed the priests that knew her, that it rocked their world. It shocked them. They couldn't believe that somebody that they were in charge of might actually be a saint. They had visions of her. Well, one of the priests had a vision of her. Actually, multiple visions of her. The people that lived around her that knew her personally had visions of her appearing as a ghost. Different kind of very supernatural things. And priests in those days, even today, they don't go in for that hocus pocus, ghosty kind of stuff. They don't. No. So, confronting the miracles of this woman, they decided to put her to the test. They took things that she touched, that she made, clothes that she wore, the bowl that she ate from. They took that around to whenever somebody was sick in the surrounding French settlements, and they prayed over these people with these artifacts and documented all of the cures that happened. So after a while, they became convinced she was a real saint. Even though they didn't believe any native person was even capable of being a real, true Christian. That was their real mindset, and that was why they were so troubled by this new revelation, is that they said, we have a real saint on our hands. So they wrote her life stories, they shipped them off to France, they ended up getting viewed in the Vatican, and they became a genre of materials that are all over the world. There's probably been about 500 books written about her in multiple different languages, multiple different countries. She became actually a propaganda piece for the church, as a missionary success story. So a lot of people won't go near that. They won't go near, and especially my people, the Longhouse people, they don't want to hear about it. They don't want to go near that story, because to them it's just propaganda. It's just indoctrination. But I say to people, read those original sources about her life. Those priests aren't lying. They're not making up stories. They're not crafting a new chapter of the lives of the saints. They're actually grappling with what they saw and witnessed as human eyewitnesses to her story. They're very honest about it. For instance, the main missionary in Kahnawake, where she lived, was a whole village of praying Indians, as they say. He went to France, left the mission in charge of the two younger priests who knew Gadali personally. And while the other priest was gone, there was kind of a fad in the village. Somebody figured out that the priests would occasionally whip themselves to beat out any human impulses. Like if a pretty girl walked by, they'd run out behind the church and whip themselves. And so the Indians saw that, so they asked, what does it you do in secret? And they said, well, we do that, we hurt ourselves so that we can share in the cross of Christ. We can feel closer to him and the suffering that he endured. Well, the Indians that heard that said, well, if you do that, how come you didn't teach it to us? We want to do that. Next thing you know, there was everybody in the village was dreaming up ways to share in the suffering of Christ, to whip themselves. They would even cut holes in the ice and submerge themselves, say their prayers in the river water. When there was a blizzard, they would walk around the cornfields saying the rosary. So they just went out of their way to find ways to prove themselves worthy of this new faith. This is how serious those people were. And St. Gadali and her companions, she had a small following of females, they did the same thing too. And that's what broke this young woman's health. She had already suffered smallpox as a child, so she was in poor health all through her life. But this broke her, caused her death. And so the priests admit that in their journals, in their diaries, and their biographies that they wrote. They admit that everything got out of hand. So they're very honest about their shortcomings. So this is far from a crazy propaganda piece that they're writing. They were brutally honest about their shortcomings and their failings, because they really did let it get out of hand, and they didn't know how to deal with it when they realized it was out of hand. So a very human story is being told, but there's that whole supernatural element to it. And you have to kind of wonder, in considering her life, is well, yes, she's a Catholic saint now, but what might have happened, say, for instance, what if somebody else got to her before the Jesuit priests? What if some Chinese monks snuck into North America, went to Mohawk country? Who knows? Maybe she still would have been some kind of spiritual force or a leader. I don't know. I really don't know. But it just is enough there to make you want to know more. Want to probe and find out and to dig into that story. So that's what I did. In that book, I wanted I call it The Lily Among Thorns, because it's a Bible verse that the priest, she's called the Lily of the Mohawks, and it goes back to a biblical verse, a lily among thorns, and which is basically saying that when somebody is really steeped in their love of the Lord and have that fervor, then suddenly they stand out from everyone around them. And that's what they were kind of implying by that expression of a lily among thorns. So when they're calling her Lily of the Mohawks, they're implying that the Mohawks are the thorns. So it's kind of a little back punch to her people, but elevating her. So I had to zero in on that as the title of my book. And the subtitle is Mohawk Repatriation of Gadali to Gakwita. Repatriation as in, just like my job where I repatriate artifacts, is I'm repatriating her story from all the people that have had it all these years and bringing it back to us. So to illustrate the book, I hired I had a lot of photos from projects I'd been involved in of people all decked out in the way we used to look in colonial times, with their hair all cut back to here and the war paint, all of the artifacts. So I had a lot of these kind of photographs, and then I hired people to pose for new photos, and then I handed all those pictures over to a friend of mine in Kahnawake, his name is Ross Montour, a wonderful artist. And so he made pen and ink illustrations of all of these people. So it gave the book that real life kind of feel, that this is not just somebody prowling through old sources, but it's a product of her people to honor her, you know. So we're dressing up in that period attire to look kind of like her people and her. I hired a couple of young women to dress up as her. So it's all in the book and it's all illustrated. And shortly after, they announced that she was going to be canonized. So it had nothing to do with my book. I'm sure the Pope was inspired. But it was just part of the whole thing of my maturation as a history guy, that I was going to go and write about. Because everybody was like, oh, we don't want to hear about the Catholics. Well, duh, that's 3 centuries of our past. What are you going to do? Make up some fanciful story of, I don't know, Harry Potter stuff or what? So I said, no, I'm gonna give her her due and put her in her context, explain the culture she came from. And so I'm off and running. My next book, of course, was this one, which I've already talked to you about. And my next book after this is going to be about another colonial figure, a man named Colonel Lewis Cook. Yeah, a Louis guy back there, yeah.
I know who he is.
Yeah. He was, first of all, he was the son of an African man and an Abenaki woman who was captured in one of our famous raids where we raided Saratoga in 1745. So he was captured and adopted by the Kahnawake Mohawks, rose up through the ranks, was a warrior in the Indian War, and then in the American Revolution, he was the head of the pro-American faction, which was a very small faction, was given a commission as a captain and then a lieutenant colonel by Washington and Schuyler, and was basically the head of the Tuscarora and Oneida warriors that fought on the side of the Americans, while pretty much everybody else fought on the side of the British. So he kind of went against the grain. And then when the War of 1812 broke out, he was in his 70s and still rallied to the American cause. Was given an honorary general commission in a full uniform. So maybe he wasn't really an honorary, but at the age of 77, and I don't mean to make that sound old because I look around the room and someone's but he was involved at Lundy's Lane over in the Niagara frontier and supposedly fell off his horse. How the hell he got the horse across the river, I don't know, but was injured and succumbed to his injuries, and probably the most historical figure from Akwesasne history. Not just because of the war, but because as a pro-American in our community, that's where he ended up, was at Akwesasne. After the American Revolution, they had drawn a border through our community, probably drawn by people who didn't even know there was a community there, looking at a big map in France. And the border came down the St. Lawrence River until it reached the 45th parallel. They said, this is where it's going to go all the way to, it'll form the northern border of New York, New Hampshire, and whatever the heck is out there, till it reaches Maine. So that became the border. So Lewis Cook, living there at the time, seized upon that. And he had been asked by the local councils to go and see if he could negotiate any kind of deal about our lands. We had heard the Americans were buying up Indian land like crazy in all kinds of treaties, and the chiefs were worried that our lands were going to get sold out from underneath us. So they sent him. It was quite a controversial arrangement. After he got done, they signed a treaty, basically quit claiming our hunting grounds in the northern part of the state, except for a small reserve, 6 miles square, where we are now. And they added to it a mile square in Messina, New York, which starts at where the Alcoa Bridge is, the new Alcoa Bridge. basically the heart of Messina, is an Indian reservation. And then another one of those in Fort Covington, which you've probably never heard of. But anyway, so he managed to add that to the reservation proper, and signed the treaty, came home, and instead of ratifying the treaty with all of the communities that were a part of this so-called Seven Nations of Canada, he decided, nope, since my name's on the treaty, I'm going to go and get the money every year, that every annuity that they pay out in Plattsburgh, since my name's on the treaty, I'm going to go and get it. So he kept it. And he basically set himself up and his little faction as the American St. Regis Indians, as opposed to the British St. Regis Indians who were living north of that imaginary line and hadn't even been surveyed yet in the village. So it was kind of like a little revolution that he managed to perpetuate by breaking away from the bulk, the main body, and using the treaty annuities as their little startup money to basically become a new entity to govern the American side of the reservation. That entity today is called the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe. That's the government on the American side of the reservation that hired me to be their historic preservation officer. So meanwhile, on the Canadian side, that chief council was eventually supplanted by the elected council, which later became known as the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. So in Akwesasne we have just this wide diversity of different councils at various times. It's a very complicated story about our political evolution. It's all on my website if you ever want to visit the Wampum Chronicles. It's a whole subset of my website. It's called Too Many Chiefs, Not Enough Indians. Never has a saying been more appropriate than that. So it was me basically sorting all of that huge mess out to explain why we have two councils. And normally our chiefs like to decry the presence of the border. Oh, we didn't draw that border out. We're not on the border, it's on us, all that stuff, right? But really having that border drawn through our community was the best thing that ever happened for us. I'll tell you right now. Because if you get fired from one of those councils, apply for the other one. Most reservations have one band council. We got two of them, man. And they don't call each other. Like if you apply for one and you don't get the job, try the similar position at the other one, you might get it. And many of my colleagues, and myself included, have worked at both. You know, we've gone from one to the other. It's okay, it's allowable. So we do have these great big infrastructures, and we've made the best of the fact that, you know, the border is through our territory. The outside law enforcement used to come visit us and they would say, boy, Chief, you got quite a reservation here, or should I say two reservations. We call this back home the jurisdictional nightmare because we've got Ontario, Quebec, New York State, Franklin County, St. Lawrence County, the jurisdictional nightmare. Eventually our chiefs start to call it that too. I had to correct them on that. I said, don't be adopting that. That concept is not ours. That's outside cops that would say that to us. You should never, ever, ever call your community a jurisdictional nightmare. There's only one jurisdiction, and that's us. It's our territory. It's one damn community. When we go to other reservations and we say, oh, I'm from Akwesasne, they don't say, which one? North or south? The American or Canadian? No, it's just one community. So, we have our movements. There's always people. They join the Longhouse on day one. Day two, they're demanding that both of those elected governments get out of town. You know what I mean? So that's always out there. That's something that comes out of your blood, I guess. They just see that as incompatible, you know, because these elected councils were brought in under kind of suspicious, kind of curious, not always kosher for our sake, but in the century since they came in, we've adjusted them, we've modified them, we've changed the codes, we've worked on it. And countless of our people have run and won those offices. Big in my family, my mother was the first female chief on the American side. My grandfather had been a chief on the Canadian side. My uncle had been a chief. My mother's brother, other uncle, Philip Tarbell, he had been a chief on the American side too. So being elected and running for chief is just it's part of my family business. I actually was elected chief myself. I was a chief for 3 years on the Canadian side, starting in 2000. So I call that my term in the Israeli army. Never did it again. Because it can get brutal. And I think being a little history guy kind of helped me to get that, because as a chief, you're always having to kind of answer about the past. That people want to know that you're not only in modern times, but you also have a little bit of connection or knowledge of treaties, history, all of that stuff. So I think that got me in the door. The fact that I had already had a reputation as a bit of a history guy. And so I stayed with it, worked for just about every employer on the res, all the governments, all the cultural centers at some point or another. And have had quite a go of it, you know. For a field, a profession, history, like I said, good luck getting a job in the history industry. It's scattered here and there, you know, and that I've been able to at least stay in the game for almost 30 years. Or maybe it's been more than 30 years. Oh boy, I'm still blown away by that. I still managed to be able to do that as a profession. As you know, like when I go to work, I have other duties, but I also have the chance to poke and prod where I need to look for history and continue to work on projects and stuff like that, and get out into the world to spread that with other communities, universities, museums, libraries, historical associations, whatever. Whoever wants me to come out and share that, I usually try to do it. Not so much in the post-pandemic period, still pandemic by the way, because mostly for concern for my wife, that I don't want to bring home something that she's going to then carry to the hospital. So I'm constantly on guard. So it's only been recently that I've been getting back out on the road again to do talks like this. And I have to run it by my wife first before I accept a gig. I have to run it by her. I don't mind doing that. But there's more to come. There's more great things. The 250th anniversary of the American Revolution is coming up. That's going to be huge. I was a kid when the bicentennial happened. Barely remember it. But the coming celebration is going to be pretty astronomical. They're already divvying up the money for grants and all that. We're not getting any, but other people are. So there's going to be a natural interest in the Haudenosaunee participation in the war. I've already been interviewed by Ken Burns, the PBS guy, the great documentary guy. His crew interviewed me about a month ago in Saratoga, and that's all they wanted to know about was Colonel Lewis Cook, Joseph Brant, Molly Brant, and all of those intricate little dealings with the different confederacies and how we got involved on one side or the other. They want to know all that stuff. So I was more than happy to share it with them, to explain why the motivations, why were we on both sides? And I'll leave you with that thought. Well, it makes sense. It makes sense to have people on both sides. Some people, when they look at history, they say, oh, the Indians were done in by the fact that they couldn't stay unified. You know, they had some guys running off fighting for the French, some for the English, some for the Americans, blah, blah, blah. If they'd all just stayed unified, well, let's just dispense with that notion altogether. It makes sense to have little pockets of pro this or pro that in your community, especially when the war breaks out. Because Should it go one way or the other? And you never know which way it's going to go. Even the American Revolution, most people thought the British were going to handily conquer a bunch of revolting colonies. But it didn't work out that way. As some of you personally remember. Just kidding. But it makes sense that when it's going to go one way or the other, at least you have somebody in your community that's known to be pro that side. Perhaps they can negotiate a better future for the ones who are neutral or on the other side. So it makes sense to have those ambassadors, as I call them, to help in the peacetime the transition to a new regime, if it has to be. So it makes sense and to have that. And it wasn't a great sin or a crime at the time. They tolerated it because they knew you don't know how it's going to go. Maybe it'll work out. And that's what happened with Colonel Lewis. The bulk of the Seven Nations of Canada alliance along the St. Lawrence River was pro-British. They had just switched over from the French to the British at the end of the French and Indian War. So they felt obligated to fight on the side of the British during that conflict. And it was only because the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras had bad blood with the British that they kind of went to the American side. And Colonel Lewis Cook, who had felt more connection to the French from the French and Indian War, that he could never resolve to becoming a good British citizen. He refused to ever swear any kind of loyalty to the king. And so when the American Revolution broke out, he was on that side. Before there even was the Declaration of Independence signed, the Americans invaded Canada. And some of you know that, but some of you may not. It's kind of been torn right out of the history books because they got their asses kicked, driven back at the Battle of Cedars. Look it up. It's on Wikipedia. And there's a great new book out about that. I can't remember the name of it, but it starts with Colonel Lewis Cook. The very first page is describing Colonel Lewis Cook as the pro-American Indian who helped as much as he could that invasion and was disappointed to see them give it up and go back to the States. So he's getting a little bit more attention now. And there's a few other books that mention him, but he's going to be big. So I'm furiously working on his life story. It'll be a new book. I don't know, maybe by next year I might have something ready to print and publish. So it'll be huge, I hope. It's my retirement project. This was my COVID project. That's going to be my retirement project. I call it Freedom 58. We'll see how that goes. But anyway, I'll be happy to sign any copies of my books that are available. The association was really awesome. The previous president put an order in, so they're here. I'd be happy to autograph them for you if you'd like. Does anybody have any questions about any of the things I talked about? Yes, sir.
Why haven't you mentioned the Six Nations that the Mohawk is part of? Are you still associated with that?
Well, when I talk about the Six Nations, I always just call them the Haudenosaunee.
Okay.
That's basically our word for the extended lodge. So that's what I'm talking about when I say Haudenosaunee. And generally, I'm talking about the Six Nations Confederacy.
But
the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and then Tuscarora.
Are you still associated in any way?
Well, yeah, in general, yeah.
Traditionally?
Yeah, well, I'm not a traditional, like, longhouse follower. I don't go to all that kind of stuff, but that's a present thing in our community.
Okay.
And I use wampum belts and I talk about the old legends and stories, so I'm kind of connected to that in a sense, but politically I'm not really, you know.
Well, what about the Mohawk Nation?
The Mohawk Nation is a part of that.
Part of that.
They go and attend the Grand Councils at Onondaga. So that, yeah, I did work for them for a little bit.
That's a continued tradition then.
Yeah, that's a revival kind of thing in our community.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's,
Thank you.
yeah, that's that. Yes, in the back row?
I assume you know that Franklin Hough is a native of St. Lawrence County. Born here.
Yeah, yeah. As much as I could uncover of his biography, and there is a little biographical notice right at the very back of the book that I republished in there also. Talks about his background, his education, and all of that, the different things that he did. And yes, he's the big dog of North Country history. He published a history of Jefferson County, couple other big things. He also published some of the journals of like, I forget which one it was, a French.
Duryea.
Pardon?
Duryea.
Yeah. And also Pouchot, he published his diary or journal, and that's been republished too. So yeah, he really produced a lot. And you gotta, if you're a history person, you gotta tip your hat to Franklin Hough, who gathered so much stuff. So a lot of those materials that he drew from might not even exist anymore. They might have just disintegrated or been, like, a lot of stuff got burned up in the state capitol fire of 1911. So sometimes the only place to find that stuff is in his publications. And so yeah, he's the real big historical figure that we all kind of owe a debt to. And they had nothing but pen and paper and their feet to go around and visit. Not like today where you can get on the internet. Is everybody a historian today? If you're not a historian, why aren't you? Because so much is available now just by the internet. Everybody should be a historian. But for him, he had to really travel and sacrifice a lot of his own time, and he walked. That's another thing I point out in the book, is that he was a walker. He was a geologist too. He would go and poke around and digging up wonderful specimens, put them in a backpack, and then walk all the way home, 40 miles overnight. And so that's the kind of people that were in our past, that they didn't care. They wanted to know, they wanted to do it, so they did it. And they didn't sit and cry about it, they went out and did it. So I'm in complete awe of Franklin B. Hough, you know. And it's trendy today in Indian country to disparage all of those old scholars. Oh, they're also colonial. Yeah. But hey, they saved a ton of stuff that we all need to know. We need to know what's there. So that's where I stand. Yes, you have a question?
How has the traditional Renaissance affected the relationship between the councils and the Longhouse?
Oh wow. That's a whole lecture.
Dummy version.
It's been contentious, but in present time, there are a lot of traditional Longhouse people who will be at the ceremony one day and then are actual members of the councils, the elected councils. I think we have 2 current sitting council members from the St. Regis Mohawk Tribe who are Longhouse people. There's been maybe 6 or so in the past. And also on the Canadian side, our longest standing Grand Chief on the Canadian side was Mike Mitchell, and he's a Longhouse person, was born in that system. And so he was a part of that for years and years, and there's, you know, so that, the old division of between you either Longhouse and you stay the heck away from that, that's all fading away. Some people still adhere to that, but then there's others that say these elected councils aren't going anywhere. We might as well get in there and try to make them work for us. So the 3 councils at Akwesasne, when I mean the 3, is the 2 elected councils and the Mohawk Nation Council of Chiefs, were actually party to our American land claim. They all submitted separately, but then the federal judge joined them together. So they had to stay, they had to have meetings, they had to kind of coordinate. And so now we have an actual settlement of our New York land claim, which I'm very happy for and pleased to have some little dealing with it. And that's just unheard of these days, because there's almost no Indian success stories with land claims anymore. That's kind of been done in by the Sherrill decision. Do you have a question?
Is that just the mile square in Messina, or is there more than that?
Oh, the mile square in Messina and the mile square in Fort Covington are not really part of.
Okay.
Those were,
Bigger.
yeah, they got kicked out. But what kept our land claim alive was the fact that there's a triangle within the 6 mile square of Akwesasne that was sold without a federal approval.
Oh, okay.
So that kept our land claim alive. It survived all the other past negative decisions. But those other outlying mile squares kind of got the heave
So
ho.
there's a triangle that goes right through.
Yeah, and it's a part of our reserve at the bottom part,
Yeah.
right in downtown Hogansburg.
Yeah,
So-
there was the old house that had the big
Yeah,
steep roof, and that was in that triangle.
yeah, they call that the Lost Dauphin house. He never lived there.
Yeah.
And he wasn't the Lost Dauphin of France. He was just a crazy minister from Kahnawake. Didn't like being a crazy minister from Kahnawake. That's another thing. He mentions that there's a triangular A-frame in Hogansburg. It's been totally, it's not anything historical anymore. It's just been completely revamped.
Yeah, I was sad to see that years ago.
Yeah, my uncle owned that for a long time,
Oh, wow.
and he restored it kinda, not really.
It was a
Kind of
beautiful home
modernized.
before it was remodeled.
Yeah,
It's still
and
nice the way it is, but it was
Yeah.
beautiful before.
and in the 70s when it was more original, well, it had a state marker in front of it called, it said, "This is where the Lost Dauphin of France lived," and, well, you know how those state markers are, they're not the most historic there. But that minister that lived there, Reverend Eliezer Williams, who knew Colonel Louis and all those guys personally, he came up with this idea that he was the lost heir to the throne of France, that when the king and queen were executed in the revolution, that he was spirited away from prison by the Scarlet Pimpernel and smuggled to the United States and was raised by the Indians. And so he kind of rallied to that and got a lot of attention, but he was generally a charlatan, a man of questionable, well, you know, he was just a liar. He was really with bad news. Not a good missionary either. He wasn't a very successful missionary, but he also wrote the biographies of Colonel Lewis Cook and his own father, Thomas Williams, and William Gray, that Franklin Hough used as the basis for what he wrote about those people in his book. So Franklin Hough met Eliezer Williams and didn't buy for a second that he was the Lost Dauphin of France. But he didn't bring attention to that because he was using his materials and incorporating them into his own work, so he downplayed the controversy. But there's no question that Eliezer Williams is accounted for as an actual person from Kahnawake. It's just he was a very colorful character, and he aspired to being part of white society. Like I said, the 1800s, it really did a number on people's thinking, and he was a victim of that. But, you know, there was a recent book about him by Michael Oberg, and basically saying he was a charlatan, you know, a real preposterous, ridiculous person. But he was also our first historian. He's the first one to meet. So I have to kind of acknowledge that, you know. And we know so much about Colonel Lewis because of it, Reverend Eliezer Williams and Franklin Hough. So I'm very cautious about condemning Eliezer too much. He was a very colorful character. There's photographs of him that still exist. And it was kind of a big deal. And that house that he supposedly lived in that had the state marker, it was owned by the Episcopal Church for a time. But Michael Oberg uncovered the fact that that house had been really old by the time Eliezer Williams ever came to Akwesasne. It predated him. So it wasn't built for him. And people would say, well, it's a big A-frame, so it's built like a French chalet in honor of his claim. Nonsense. There's so much nonsense in history, so much BS, that you in addition to the sweater with the leather patch, you also have to have some pretty thick rubber boots to make your way through the meadow, because there's so much hokum out there that just to sort through to get to the real stuff is quite a task. And so Eliezer is kind of, because of his preposterous claim to the throne of France, has overshadowed Akwesasne. So when you go looking through the old newspaper accounts, you'll see that written about us. Akwesasne, oh, it's got the lost king of France. Well, forget all that. What is the real story of Akwesasne? So I've been trying to get to that. Sir?
Different question. Maybe I'm wrong on this, but I understand through history that not much of the written word has been done by the native Mohawks. Consequently, it's mostly oral. Is there a, for want of a better word here, a particular place for folks who want to do research on any of the early history of the 19th century, whatever the case?
Well, when it comes to the oral history and stuff like that, I've tried to solicit that, you know, like when people tell me, oh, there's some guy that knows a little bit, I do my best to find out what I can, you know. And a lot of that, though, when you ask people about old stuff, it's very rare that they'll talk about some, like the wars. There's a few people that talk about stuff they remember hearing about British troops being in their village, which would have been the War of 1812, because there was an actual battle or a skirmish right in the village of St. Regis near the church, right at the beginning of the war.
Well, pretty more contemporary, 1920s, 1930s.
Yeah, there's been a few projects where we've documented, you know, those kind of oral stories and oral traditions. I worked on a Akwesasne Elders Life Histories project in 1999 for the band council, where I went around with video cameras and audio equipment and recorded people's life stories. And the oldest people on the res, most of them, I think, or if not all of them, have passed on since then. And so I did. I tried to kind of feel out what stories they might have heard from the far distant past. And I'm sorry, but there's just not, they just didn't have that kind of stuff. You know, they talk more about functional day-to-day kind of things. Like when I asked them, what kind of stories did your grandfather tell you? You know, you're then talking about somebody from the 1800s. And usually it was more about day-to-day kind of stuff, not about the grandiose pageantry of the past like we hope. Even the chiefs, even the traditional chiefs, did not have that kind of thing. So it's kind of like a fantasy kind of thing these days when people say, oh, you study old history books, well, why don't you go and get the oral tradition? I'm like, okay, yeah, okay, great. Have at it, bud. You know what I mean? But also, when you study the documents, that's when you start to see oral history recorded. Like, for instance, we have a wampum belt. In fact, I'll show you a replica of it. Okay. We have a repatriated belt in Akwesasne. It's called the Wolf Belt. If you go to the Akwesasne Library, you'll see the original. Dates back to the end of the French and Indian War. So it's a really old belt. This is a replica of it. And when I first started doing the history thing, the council that I worked for had a little graphic of this as their logo. So I asked one of my colleagues, one of the land claims researchers, I said, what's the story behind that belt? And she said, we don't know. We don't know the story behind the belt. We think maybe it means this, maybe it means that, but we don't know. So I went poking and prodding, and I was reading in an old census of 1890, which had a special edition about the Indians of New York. And Henry Carrington came to Akwesasne as a census researcher at that time and was interested in wampum belts because he was a collector. So he got to see this belt, and it was held by a woman in the community who was a descendant of Colonel Lewis Cook. And she said, of this belt, she said, we will live together or we will die together. We promise this as long as water runs, skies do shine, and night brings rest. And she further described it as a peace treaty between King George and the 7 nations of Canada. That sounds like the end of the French and Indian War to me. So I published an article saying, well, I found this little historical account that contains the oral tradition for this belt. So the people that were telling a different story about the belt decided that was just too damn much. We've heard enough from Mr. Bonaparte. Because they had a story that said, well, we made this belt when we established our community. Each family made a bead and provided a bead. Come on, you know? I think they canceled Walt Disney, so we don't have to come up with stories like that anymore. Anyway, so I'm pretty sure that's the story behind the belt. Just like that lady said, she had it in her possession, refused to sell it to Mr. Carrington, who had been a general in the U.S. Army, refused to sell it. And then when she died, it ended up in the possession of her nephew, who was a showman called Chief Running Deer. And he then sold it to Harriet Maxwell Converse, who was a folklorist and also a socialite in New York City. She bought it and then sold it to the New York State Museum. Now, whether she heard the story about King George or not, we don't know. But she then told the New York State Museum that it had some other story, that it was associated with the Wolf Clan of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, made it more attractive to them, so they bought it. So it sat in Albany for a century, repatriated it and brought it home. So that's the story of that belt. So kind of give you a little idea of how oral traditions are recorded. A century ago, the chiefs, the elders, the knowledge keepers knew that the world was changing around them, their people were changing, so they were terrified of this knowledge being lost. So they sat with any scholar who would sit down with them and poured out everything they knew. The Great Law of Peace, the creation story, the Code of Handsome Lake, all of that stuff was recorded in the late 1800s by scholars and some of our own people who could read and write. They thought it was all going to fade away. They thought it was over, so they had to get it recorded. So that's what scholars like me and other people in the Confederacy are doing, is going back to those old sources to try to recover that kind of knowledge that was going to be lost otherwise. So are those oral traditions and stuff still alive in our communities? I hear hints of it, especially on social media. Some of my friends in the community occasionally will let a little bit of that stuff out, but to me it's kind of like a disappointing thing when you actively say, I'm going to go out and seek that. Suddenly it dries up on you and you're like, you know, you meant well, but for some reason it's kind of hard to track some of that stuff down. But talk to people about their actual families and oh man, that stuff comes flying out. And so you take what you get, you know, and you learn to appreciate the stories that people do tell and don't yearn for what they didn't tell, you know. So anyway, I want to leave it at that. And thank you all very much for coming out to.